Think for a moment. What if some of the most powerful words ever spoken by Jesus were never meant to reach the masses? Imagine that hidden behind centuries of doctrine, ritual, counsels, and carefully curated scripture, there exist teachings so liberating, so disruptive to established power, that they had to be removed from public reach. Teachings that did not encourage submission to an external authority, but instead pointed directly inward, toward self-knowledge, awakening, and the realization of a living divine presence within every human being. What if the most radical message of Jesus was not centered on fear of judgment, blind obedience, or a distant paradise after death, but on inner freedom, expanded consciousness, and direct communion with the source of all existence? Imagine Jesus not only as a religious icon, but as a master of hidden wisdom, a bearer of knowledge that stretched back through ancient civilizations and mystery schools. A teacher who understood the invisible architecture of reality, the subtle forces that shape mind, matter, and destiny. While official doctrine later presented him almost exclusively as a figure to be worshipped from afar, certain forbidden writings described him as a guide, leading others to discover the same divine potential within themselves. This version of his message was not safe for empires or institutions that depended on control. It was too empowering. And power that does not come from thrones is the most feared of all. Before we move any deeper into these concealed teachings, I ask you to take a simple but meaningful step. Subscribe to the channel, leave your like, comment what drew you to this subject, and share this video with someone who feels the same pull toward hidden knowledge and ancient truth. What will be revealed throughout this journey is not ordinary information. These revelations have the potential to change the way you see life, the world, your own mind, and the universe itself. History, as many have said, is written by those who hold authority, but spiritual history is often written in secret, in silence, and in whispers passed from one generation to another. In the early centuries after Jesus walked the earth, countless texts circulated among different groups of followers. Some focused on his miracles, others on his parables. But there were also writings that went far beyond that. They spoke about consciousness. They spoke about the illusion of separation. They spoke about the divine nature of the human soul. They taught that the true temple was not a building of stone, but the inner world of awareness, that the true altar was the heart, that the true prayer was knowing. For those who would later build empires on religion, such ideas were not considered sacred. They were seen as dangerous. Councils were formed, doctrines were established, and decisions were made about which writings would become official and which would be condemned. Entire gospels were labeled heretical. Some were burned, some were hidden, some were buried in the earth itself, waiting for a future time when humanity might be ready to encounter them again. One of the most astonishing discoveries in modern times came from the deserts of Egypt, where ancient texts lay hidden for centuries beneath sand and stone. Among them was the Gospel of Thomas, a collection of sayings attributed to Jesus that are largely absent from the traditional Bible. In these sayings, Jesus does not speak of creating massive institutions or enforcing rigid systems. Instead, he speaks of perception. He says that the kingdom is already spread upon the earth, but people do not see it. He says that when a person comes to know themselves, they will be known, and they will realize that they are a child of the living divine source. Such words struck at the very foundation of religious hierarchy. If the kingdom is within, then no one can own it. If God can be experienced inside the self, then no priest, no ruler, no authority figure can stand as the only gatekeeper. Suddenly, the path to the divine becomes personal, intimate, and direct, and a person who realizes their own inner light cannot be easily controlled through fear, guilt, or promises of distant reward. Renowned scholars such as Elaine Pagels, Karen King, and other academic authorities have studied these alternative texts in depth. Their research reveals that early Christianity was not a single unified belief system, but a diverse spiritual landscape composed of many interpretations, many communities, and many understandings of Jesus and his message. Some of these groups believed that salvation came through knowledge, awakening, and inner transformation rather than submission and law. Over time, those voices were silenced, and a more rigid structure replaced the original diversity of thought. Here is the question that now comes to you. Why would teachings based on self-knowledge, inner divinity, and personal awakening be declared forbidden? The answer is both simple and uncomfortable, because a person who knows who they truly are cannot be ruled by illusion. A person who recognizes the divine within themselves does not need permission to exist in truth. That awareness alone is revolutionary. These forbidden words do not belong only to one religion or one time. They echo through Hermetic philosophy, through ancient Egyptian wisdom, through Gnostic traditions, and even through mystical teachings of the East. They are reflected in the principle that what is within is mirrored without, that consciousness shapes reality, and that the universe itself is mental in nature. These are not merely poetic ideas, they are keys to understanding existence. As you listen to this, ask yourself, what if the real message of Jesus was never about waiting for a savior to return from the skies, but about remembering the Savior that has always lived within you, silent, ignored, yet infinitely powerful? And this is only the first layer. The deeper words, the more challenging truths, and the most powerful revelation of all still lies ahead. Listen carefully now, because what comes next moves beyond history and into the realm of the unseen. There are sayings attributed to Jesus that were considered so dangerous, so destabilizing to accepted religious structures, that they were never allowed into the official doctrine. One of these teachings speaks not of worshipping an external figure, but of awakening an internal reality. He is said to have declared that if your leaders tell you the kingdom is in the sky, then the birds will reach it before you. If they say it is in the sea, then the fish will reach it first. But the truth is that the kingdom is inside you, and it is outside you at the same time. This single idea was a direct threat to any system that claimed exclusive access to the divine. Consider what that truly means. If the kingdom is within you, then you do not need a temple to find it. You do not need a priest to access it. You do not need permission to reach it. You only need awareness. This was not a message of dependency. It was a message of remembrance. And it was precisely this kind of message that frightened those who sought to rule through spiritual hierarchy. There are writings that show Jesus describing the world as an illusion, a passing shadow, a reflection of a deeper and higher reality that can only be perceived by those who awaken. In these texts, he speaks of the material world as a veil, and knowledge as the path through it. This is not the language of religious law. This is the language of mysticism. It parallels ancient Hermetic ideas that reality is shaped by the mind, and that human consciousness is a mirror of the divine consciousness that created all things. When you connect this with the Hermetic principle that the universe is mental, something extraordinary begins to emerge. The idea that reality is not fixed, not rigid, not permanently outside of you. Instead, reality is fluid, responsive, and deeply connected to the observer. This was knowledge protected and passed on in secret initiations for centuries, known only to those who proved themselves worthy to hear it. And yet, here we find traces of it in forbidden sayings attributed to Jesus himself. It raises an unsettling possibility. What if Jesus was not trying to create a religion, but to initiate humanity into a higher understanding of itself? What if his true purpose was not to be worshipped, but to awaken others to the same level of consciousness he had reached? And what if that was exactly why his deeper teachings had to be buried? History tells us that after his death, his words were repeated, rewritten, translated, and interpreted by many hands. With each translation, something was added or removed. With each council, something was selected or rejected. Over time, the mystical teacher slowly transformed into a distant divine figure, separated from humanity. A gap was created where there was once a bridge. Yet, the fragments of this original message still exist, hidden in texts that survived centuries of suppression. In one saying, Jesus is described as stating that when you make the two into one, and when you make the inside like the outside and the outside like the inside, then you will enter the kingdom. This is not the language of institutional religion. This is the language of alchemy, of integration, of transcending duality, of returning to unity. Reflect for a moment on the implications of that. What if the greatest spiritual journey is not one of escape, but one of unification? What if heaven is not a destination, but a state of being reached when the divided self becomes whole again? This is why these teachings were feared, because they awaken the mind. And a mind that is awake no longer bows easily. Scholars and historians who have studied these texts agree on one undeniable fact. The message they carry is fundamentally different from the one most people were taught. It is not a message of external salvation. It is a message of inner realization, and inner realization is the doorway to true power. So now, I ask you a question that goes beyond belief and touches experience. If the divine is truly within you, what part of yourself have you been taught to ignore? And we are still only moving closer to the surface of the deepest revelation. There is one final layer that surpasses all the others, a teaching so transformative that it has the power to alter not only your spiritual understanding, but the way you perceive reality itself. What you are about to hear reaches deeper than doctrine, deeper than tradition, and deeper than even the most carefully guarded secrets of religious power. There exists a line of thought among scholars and mystics alike that certain teachings of Jesus were not only removed but reversed in meaning when they were filtered through political and theological authority. Words that once pointed to inner liberation were slowly reshaped into messages of submission. Concepts that were meant to awaken humanity were transformed into rules that restrained it. And yet, traces of the original meaning still exist for those who are willing to look beneath the surface. In several non-canonical writings, Jesus is portrayed not as someone who demands unquestioning worship, but as someone who invites deep self-discovery. He does not place himself on an unreachable pedestal. Instead, he speaks as one who has remembered and who is urging others to remember as well. He asks people not simply to follow him, but to understand what he understood. He challenges them to look beyond appearances, beyond labels, beyond the illusion of separation between human and divine. One of the most unsettling ideas contained in these hidden sayings is this, that what humanity calls God is not an external ruler, but an internal source, that the divine is not distant, but present, not divided, but unified, not limited, but infinite. If this concept is taken seriously, everything changes. It means that every human being carries the same spiritual potential that has been projected onto prophets, saints, and messengers. It means that spiritual power does not descend from the sky, but rises from the depths of consciousness. This idea reflects teachings found in ancient Hermetic wisdom, where the mind is seen as the foundation of all creation. It also aligns with esoteric traditions that describe the human being as a living microcosm of the greater universe. As above, so below. As within, so without. These are not just symbolic statements. They describe a spiritual structure of reality that was once studied in secret and kept away from the masses. Because a population that understands its own power cannot be easily ruled. Consider how different the world would be if, from childhood, every person were taught that the source of wisdom, strength, and truth lives inside them. Would they be as easily manipulated? Would they give their power away so freely? Would fear control them so completely? Or would they walk with awareness, intention, and inner authority? Jesus is recorded in hidden texts as saying that light is inside a person of light and it lights up the whole world. But if a person is without that light, then there is darkness. This is not about moral judgment from an external deity. It is about awareness. The light is consciousness. The darkness is ignorance of one's own true nature. That is the real division. And that division is not enforced by God. It is maintained by systems that do not want humanity to awaken. Over centuries, fear-based teachings replaced knowledge-based teachings. Instead of encouraging awakening, people were told to wait for salvation, wait for forgiveness, wait for the end of time, wait for a return. But what if the waiting was the very illusion that kept them asleep? What if the hidden words of Jesus were never about waiting at all, but about realizing that the moment of awakening is always now? This kind of realization does not only change religious belief, it changes identity. A person who understands that their consciousness is connected to the source of all creation begins to see reality differently. Their thoughts change, their choices change, their relationships change. Fear loses its grip. Purpose becomes clearer. Life transforms from a chain of random events into an unfolding process of awareness. And this leads to a deeper, more uncomfortable question. If these truths existed for thousands of years, and if they have now resurfaced through ancient texts and scholarly research, why are they still not commonly taught? Why do most people never hear about them? The answer hints at a truth that will be revealed more clearly in the final portion of this journey, a truth that involves power, control, and the deliberate shaping of human perception. Ask yourself now and answer in the comments. Do you believe humanity has been intentionally kept in spiritual ignorance, or do you feel that people have been protected from knowledge they were not ready to receive? What is coming next is the most powerful part of all. It connects the words of Jesus not only to ancient wisdom, but to your personal reality in this very moment. It is the key that unites everything that has been revealed so far. If you approve this section and want me to move forward, say proceed or continue, and I will reveal the next part. There is a reason why some words attributed to Jesus were considered too dangerous to preserve. They did not encourage dependence. They did not reinforce hierarchy. They did not glorify institutions. Instead, they empowered the individual. They awakened inner authority. They revealed a path in which each human being becomes responsible for their own spiritual elevation. And throughout history, the most transformative truths have always been the ones most fiercely suppressed. When ancient manuscripts were discovered in the desert near Nag Hammadi, scholars were confronted with ideas completely different from what tradition had preserved. These writings portrayed Jesus as a teacher of hidden knowledge, someone who spoke of invisible realms, layers of consciousness, and the ability of the human being to awaken to their true nature. Instead of teaching people to seek salvation from an external force, he guided them to discover the source of truth inside themselves. This alone was enough to threaten the foundations of structured religion. But the most revealing part of these texts is not just what Jesus said, it is what he implied. In passages where he explains that the world is a shadow of something deeper, we find close parallels to ancient philosophies that describe reality as a projection of mind. Philosophers like Philo of Alexandria, and later mystics such as Meister Eckhart, touched on these same ideas, that the material world is not the ultimate truth, but a reflection, a veil, a temporary manifestation of something infinitely greater. In Hidden Sayings, Jesus is portrayed as telling his disciples that the eye of understanding must be awakened, that the physical eyes see only forms, but the inner eye sees essence. This teaching aligns with the Hermetic principle that perception shapes experience. When you see the world through fear, the world appears threatening. When you see the world through ignorance, everything becomes confusing. But when you see through awakened consciousness, creation reveals its harmony, its intelligence, and its purpose. This is not the kind of message that creates obedient followers. This is the kind of message that creates awakened individuals. And awakened individuals are impossible to control. Imagine for a moment that every person alive understood that the divine is not something they must chase, but something they already carry. Imagine a world where people know that their thoughts shape their reality, that their emotions influence the environment around them, and that every action creates a ripple through the fabric of existence. Would fear-based systems survive? Would manipulation still work? Would oppression still hold power? This may be why certain teachings had to be hidden, not because they were untrue, but because they were too true. One of the most intriguing statements from these forbidden writings describes Jesus telling his followers that whoever seeks should keep seeking until they find. And when they find, they will be disturbed. And after they are disturbed, they will marvel. And then they will reign over all. This progression is profound. It describes awakening as a process of transformation. First comes the search, then the shock of realizing that everything you thought you knew was incomplete. Then comes the wonder of discovering your true nature. And finally comes inner mastery. Notice that this sequence has nothing to do with worship. It has everything to do with consciousness. Modern scholars like Bart Ehrman, Marvin Meyer, and April DeConnick have analyzed these writings, emphasizing that they represent a dimension of spiritual teaching that the official canon does not include, a dimension that focuses less on external rules and more on internal transformation, a message that challenges individuals to break free from mental limitations and recognize the divine spark within. This is precisely the type of message that would threaten any system built on control, fear, or blind obedience. Imagine the courage it would take to speak such truths in a world dominated by empires and rigid structures. Imagine the clarity of mind required to declare that the kingdom is within, not in palaces or temples. Imagine the power of a message that tells people they do not need permission to access the divine. This is the kind of wisdom that inspires love, freedom, and awakening. And it is also the kind of wisdom that authorities fear most. But this leads us to a deeper mystery, one that becomes clearer as we move forward. Why would teachings of inner divinity be considered a threat? Why would spiritual knowledge be hidden, altered, or condemned? The answer lies in understanding how perception shapes reality and how those who control perception hold extraordinary power. There is a saying in these ancient texts that when people do not know themselves, they live in poverty, but when they know themselves, they become rich. This is not about material wealth. It is about spiritual poverty, the emptiness that comes from living disconnected from inner truth, and spiritual richness, the abundance that comes from awakening to the divine nature of consciousness. This idea is echoed in mystical traditions across the world. In the writings of Plotinus, the soul is described as a divine emanation capable of returning to its source through inner vision. In the teachings of ancient Egypt, the heart was seen as the seat of divine intelligence. In Eastern traditions, enlightenment is the realization of one's true nature beyond illusion. It is remarkable that the forbidden sayings of Jesus align with these universal truths. Now pause for a moment and reflect. If so many traditions point to the same inner reality, why has this truth been hidden from the majority of humanity? Why are people encouraged to look outward for salvation instead of inward for awakening? The final revelation of this video will address exactly that. It will connect all these threads and bring to light a teaching so powerful that it transforms not only spiritual understanding, but the way you see your own existence. Thanks for looking.